Hey, Moose, we are 160 episodes plus into our journey. If you remember, we started with a controlled hallucination. The first podcast episode, we did a tritone thing. We were trying out some new things to say that the way we perceive reality is actually a controlled hallucination. And of course, we brought on guests to help us understand that um, in different light. And some of those guests include Dr. Hippolito. We had Bobby Azarian on. We've had folks from the Active Inference Institute on. We've had a lot of neuroscientists on to help us understand how we actually engage with reality, the nature of creativity. Our guest today is Karl Friston, Professor Karl Friston. We've been talking about his work for a long time. I want to welcome you to the show and thank you for being here today. And we can call you Karl, correct?
Yes, please do. And thank you
All
very
right.
much for having me.
Oh, this is going to be great. So let me give you some background on how I came across your work. And it really begins in the psychedelic assisted therapy community, PTSD, TBI, veteran community. And if you remember years ago, and I'm holding up a book for our listeners, this is a book by Michael Pollan. It's How to Change Your Mind. I'm reading this about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago now. And I come across this idea called Rebus and entropic brain hypothesis. And it's from Robin Carhart-Harris. So I start searching for that in Google Scholar, break it down some more, and I start seeing parallels to what Moose and I are looking at with the body of work of John Boyd, and it's how living systems engage with the environment. So I keep pulling that thread, and then I have everybody in the AGLX community, all of the partners went through active inference training with Daniel Friedman over at the Active Inference Institute. And of course, that led us to like Bobby Azarian and a few others. We came across this gentleman, Patrick Skotanis, and the market mind hypothesis. And we're going to get to this a little bit later on when we talk about markets and where we're going to go with today's conversation. We'll talk about portfolio management potentially and other things. And of course, I don't know if you know this guy. This is Andy Clark. Have you ever heard of him, Karl?
Yes, I hear a lot about him. Yes,
You know a lot about him, right? So
yeah.
there's a lot that he's written about. The Experience Machine is one of the books that I've read. But do you mind sharing how you know Andy Clark?
Oh, multiple ways.
Mhm.
In fact, one of my ex-colleagues, erstwhile colleagues at UCL, moved to Edinburgh and fell in love with Andy, and they subsequently got married a few years ago
Oh,
down on
wow.
Brighton Beach. But completely independently of that, our convergent interests, him from the side of philosophy and me from the side of sort of computational neuroscience, we met in the middle. So I consider him to be a partner in crime. So he's been promoting the predictive processing angle from a philosophical perspective, and I from a sort of more technical, mathematical perspective.
Okay. So you have a slightly differing view on predictive processing. Is that correct? Or are they pretty much the
No,
same?
well, the notion of predictive processing, that sort of phrase, I think actually arose in Andy's seminal paper, Whatever Next. So
Mhm.
that was a very famous BBS, Behavioral and Brain Sciences paper, that brought the predictive processing paradigm to the foreground among philosophy of science, but also a large section of the cognitive neuroscience community. And my memory is fading now, and I may be making things up, but I do remember discussing why he didn't call it predictive coding and why he didn't call it active inference.
Okay.
And and there are sort of principal reasons for that. As I say, I may be making this up, so you have to ask Andy what
We
we
make
actually.
everything up on this show. So,
Right.
so.
So he didn't want to limit the scope or the compass of predictive processing just to perception.
Mhm.
He wanted to emphasize the inactive aspects, what would have been, and still is to a certain extent, known as active sensing and active vision, um, reflecting his commitment to embodiment and, to the 4E paradigm.
Yep.
On the other hand, he didn't want to go quite as far as active inference, because active inference is an application of the free energy principle. and that's the physics of sense making, the physics of decision making, which has some particular commitments
Okay.
to first principle accounts. So he didn't want to sort of, as a philosopher, make attach himself to some of those very technical and stringent commitments that the free energy principle entails, and you're implicitly using when you're applying the free energy principle in the form of active inference, so that he could just focus on the good stuff, which was the predictive processing stuff. So we have, I think, completely convergent and conciliant views on the nature of sense making and the nature of an embodied and situated engagement with the world. However, he is distinguished by the fact he writes very beautifully and coherently, and I don't. So from the perspective of describing these ideas, there's a marked difference between the philosopher and the physicist.
I appreciate that. His book is excellent, by the way, The Experience Machine. We've asked him to join us on our show as well. I want to bring up another book. I got a few more, and then we'll get airborne here. I think you know this guy, Anil Seth, right?
Oh,
Being
yes.
You, very popular
Yeah.
book. In fact, I think you have an event coming up with him. And my point behind the book is it goes through active inference, free energy principle as well. But you have an event coming up with Anil, is that correct?
Usually do. Yeah, he's another very close colleague and friend.
Mhm.
And interestingly, works almost next door to Andy. So they're both at the University of Sussex. And I know of Anil and Anil for a long time. He actually didn't replace me, but was a few years later a research fellow at the Neuroscientist Institute with Jerry Edelman, which is where I spent some of my formative training years. Looking at value-dependent learning. So we have a common sort of intellectual heritage there, with lots of common friends, and again, a very conciliant view on the importance. His perspective is much more sort of the beast machine perspective and interceptive inference. But I think a common commitment to predictive processing and active inference as applied to the body.
Okay, no, I appreciate that too. And then we have this famous book here, Active Inference. I think your name's on it.
Yeah.
It's a great book. It's a great textbook to run through and really dive into what we're going to talk about here in a little bit. And this new book, I'm holding up a book called "A World Appears" by Michael Pollan. Goes into the conversations on consciousness. And again, as I'm reading it, my wife was reading it. She's like, "Brian, here's the free energy principle and active inference all throughout this book." And I'm like, okay, there's something going on here. Our point behind all this is we've been following what you've been doing. We see how it connects to things in artificial intelligence. We believe it connects to strategy, teamwork, leadership. It definitely connects to the markets through the market mind hypothesis, and we think even more. We've been following your work with Michael Pollan, Michael Levin, on the Platonic Space, which is fascinating, and we might get into that today as well. And of course, Stephen Kotler. Stephen Kotler writes about Mihai's work in flow, flow states, peak performance. And again, I think there's a connection to the Platonic space or something else that's out there that I think is starting to emerge. But you have a couple papers with Stephen Kotler, one on intuition, which we might touch on today. And I think you have a new one coming up on the body keeps score, which we might touch on today. But anyway, my point behind all that again is hate to say we're huge fans, but we like the work. We think it connects well with what we believe the person we're following, John Boyd, his work, what he was trying to explain in the 80s and 90s, and the gap between what people perceive that to be today as a linear decision-making process, when in fact we think it is more aligned to both perceptual control theory, perception action loop and ecological psychology, the free energy principle, and active inference. So we like to have that discussion with you today before we get airborne, or when we get airborne here in a second. So before we share slides, I want to share with our audience that we kind of have a structure today, and hopefully it'll make sense to our listeners as to why we did it this way. It might be a complete train wreck. We'll find out here in a little bit. And before we get airborne with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karl Friston to see if he has any questions of us that we could answer before we get going.
Well, no, you seem to know more about my work and collaborators than I do. It's very impressive. Just by coincidence, that Body Keeps the Score paper was literally accepted today. I just got an email from Michael and the co-authors, so it's
Okay.
you're very current.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, I'm going to share a screen here. This is our rendering of the free energy principle and active inference. I believe it is where we have a boundary, we have external states, internal states, we have sensory states and active states. We're not going to talk about this because there's math involved, right? There's maths involved in all this, and there's a lot of symbols on there I truly don't understand. I've been learning about them, by the way. Instead, we're going to look at a simpler approach where we dive into, again, external states, internal states, active states, sensory states. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to start off with the environment. And then I'm going to ask Karl to join in and just kind of paint a picture for us. So when we talk about environment, we talk about affordances, we talk about attractors, we talk about fitness landscapes. And for those that listen to our show, they should know that the name or the title of No Way Out comes from a brief called Conceptual Spiral. And in that brief, John Boyd identifies features of the world that we just cannot eliminate. There's no way out of that, right? We have to live with these. And in front of you right now, Karl, are some of those features of the world. One of them happens to be entropy. We have ambiguity, novelty, numerical imprecision. Is there anything else we could add to this list, or you might add to this list to help explain the environment, the external world?
I think you've got all the key elements there, and much relate to the itinerancy of the environment read as the states that are external to me, just to link it to the previous slide. One thing which perhaps is picked up by the notion of novelty is that the way that one conceives of the environment from the point of view of the free energy principle is that there are a certain number of states that the environment can be in. And of all the possible states it could be in, there are a vast number it never occupies. So that's just a sort of an intuitive way of trying to express the fact that the environment has characteristic states. There are certain states that the environment will never be in, and that tells you something quite important. If it's the case that all of these aspects of the environment speak to the fact that the environment is always on the move, and from the point of view of a physicist, this would be thought of in terms of moving through some abstract state space. But the movement is important, because if you're moving and yet you have to be restricted to a certain number of states, that tells you immediately you have to revisit states or the neighborhood of states that you were once in. So there's a certain kind of closure to the dynamics that have this entropic, that have this uncertain, imprecise, ambiguous aspect in virtue of the complexity of that itinerancy on the one hand, and the random fluctuations with which the world is equipped in terms of the way it goes. So from the point of view of characterizing the environment, which is important because all of these fundamental foundational aspects of the way the environment behaves are going to be installed in your head, because you have to sort of resonate with the environment. You have to synchronize with the environment. But that synchronization does entail this sort of technically what's known as sort of non-dissipative or solenoidal flow. It just means that there are cycles, there are biorhythms out there. There are oscillations of particular kinds at every scale, whether we're talking about the motion of the heavenly bodies through to very, very fast oscillations in, in my brain, for example. So that's, I think, an important aspect, that the real world, the environment, has this sort of particular kind of itinerancy, which means it's completely unpredictable. However, you are unpredictable in a very constrained way.
Does the law of requisite variety connect to what you just shared? Is it?
Yes, I think it does, absolutely. So the law of requisite variety is one of the sort of pillars of early cybernetics, championed by certainly in the UK, people like Ross Ashby. And from what I remember, that's basically a statement. If I'm engaged with the world, and again, referring back to your Markov blanket slide, that basically is my internal states are engaged with the external states vicariously through the inputs and outputs or through the sensory and active states. Then because I am, because there is an implicit cycle, a circular causality, I'm influencing the environment through my active states. The environment is influencing me through the sensory states. That introduces a complete asymmetry, but it also tells you something quite important. It tells you that I can change the world. I can control the world. And this would be the cybernetic perspective. And what it means is if I'm in sync, and I'm using in sync as a stand-in for mathematically what would be known as generalized synchronization or synchronization of chaos, which is the free energy minimizing solution to any interaction or exchange with the world. If I'm in sync with the world, that means on the inside, I have to have as many degrees of freedom as there are controllable aspects to that world. And of course, if the world is extremely itinerant and has all of these stochastic aspects and probabilistic aspects, that means it has high degrees of freedom, which means it puts a lot of pressure on me as a good regulator, as a good engager, as a good model of what's going on the outside. That requires me to have an equivalently high number of degrees of freedom, which effectively means that as I engage with more and more complex worlds, and possibly engaging, with the lived world as we know it, but also worlds, let's say financial markets or whatever, as the world gets more and more complicated and more complex with more degrees of freedom, then there's an arms race, which means that my brain and I have to become more and more complex in order to provide an accurate account of and predict what's going on, and more crucially, of course, predict what I'm going to do in order to maintain that synchronization.
Well, let's get to Markov blanket here. You brought it up. We'll get to sensory states and active states in a moment. So we have, well, for our listeners, if you can't see this at the moment, we just added a boundary onto the environment, and I guess it's a porous boundary, meaning there is no real boundary. But can you walk us through what is meant by Markov blanket, and then talk a little bit about the generative model that's inside of it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this is a key pillar of the free energy principle, which just basically starts by asking, um, what are what is the nature of self-organization? And as soon as you ask that kind of question, you start to say, well, what is a self? So how do you define the self? How do you disambiguate the self, individuate, separate the self from the rest of the environment? So this is where the Markov blanket comes into play. And as you say, I think, quite astutely, it is a boundary, but it is a boundary that so almost paradoxically glues you to the environment. It's not something that divorces you or sequesters you from the environment. It is an interface with the environment that has this bidirectional traffic over it, which could be thought of as a sort of porous boundary. But that boundary is there to enable you to exist in some sense as separable from the environment with which you are engaged or enmeshed vicariously through these boundary states. The term Markov blanket inherits from the work of Judea Pearl, who constructed these mathematical objects on the basis of statistical dependencies, which can arise from causal links of a particular kind. And the particular kind that we're interested in here is that if there is a way of separating me from everything else, then that basically means that I must possess blanket states that can be divided into sensory and active states, which we'll get onto in a second, as you say, that are very simply defined in the sense that the external states influence my sensory states, but my internal states do not influence the sensory states. And in an exactly symmetrical way, the active states are influenced by my internal states and influence the external states, but the external states do not influence the active states. Now, that's just a very grand way of defining an input and output. So if you're a systems theorist, all I've just said is for a system to be identified or separated from a larger environment in which that system exists, it can be uniquely defined operationally in terms of its inputs and outputs. And then you just think about, what does it mean to have an input and output? Well, an input is something that you can't change. It's come from the outside. And the output is something the outside can't change because it's come from the inside.
All right. So if we put an input on the left side of this image at the moment and an output on the right side, we spend some time with Adrian Bayesian, Professor Bayesian, who came up with the constructal law. So we look at understanding flow systems. What you just described is once you put that inlet or outlet, you actually have a flow system. Is that, would you agree with that?
Yes. Yes, I would. So I'm pausing because the use of the word flow here is, again, interesting, because much of the mathematics is based upon the dynamical flow in these abstract state spaces. The other reason I was pausing is that I think it may be slightly misleading to think of this as a flow through the system. In the sense that that really does speak to something which is, in my world, somewhat outdated, which is a sort of sandwich model of cognition, for example. That, you know, there are sensory inputs and they are somehow converted on the inside into motor outputs, for example. That's not really how people sort of currently conceive of things. So the better, I think, notion is that there's a circular flow around or through the Markov blanket. And then on the inside, there's a whole hierarchy of circular flows that are informing and constraining the circular flows at the boundary itself.
Okay, we might come back to that because it's again, there's a design aspect we haven't built up yet, and we're just looking at the boundary in a generative model. Can we talk a little bit about the generative model? What that is inside of an agent or in this case, an organism?
Sure. So again, that's a really important question because it is the second move that you get with the free energy principle. So if there exists a way of, in this statistical fashion, separating self from non-self, what one can then do or show is that the action of the self on the world or the environment can always be described as if it is acting under a generative model. So what does a generative model mean? Well, a generative model in this setting is simply a probabilistic description of the cause-effect structure that is producing your sensory inputs. So you have now a model that can generate the predictions of what would be sensed if you knew the underlying cause. So I use the word cause-effect structure in the spirit of there are causes of my sensory impressions on my Markov blanket out there. They can never be observed. They're always hidden behind the Markov blanket. And in machine learning and artificial intelligence research, these are known as hidden or latent states or causes. And then there are observable consequences. There are observations. On the basis of the observations, I can infer what caused it. I'll never know. You mentioned hallucinations earlier on with Inish and I presume Neil Seth will probably get a look in. He loves that that notion. So these hallucinations, these fantasies, these what Neil in more serious moments would call inference to the best explanation, are just inferences, because you're never in direct contact with these states or causes out there, because you're separated from them by your Markov blanket. So that inference basically proceeds under this model that you have on the inside that could basically explain what could have caused these particular sensory impressions upon your Markov blanket.
Is it safe to say that all living organisms have a generative model or an internal model of the external world, including cells, or what is it, a fractal approach, or is this, how does that work?
I think it would be safe to say it if you said it to the right people. But you would, I think the safest way of saying that is that anything that can be individuated from its environment, thereby it must possess a Markov blanket, can be read as or described as if it was making inferences, perceiving and acting under some kind of generative model. Having said that, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different kinds of generative models, which means that there are different natural kinds. And by natural kind, I just mean some system that has a Markov blanket. And there are sort of certain limiting cases that you would recognize intuitively. So one limiting case would be that the whole thing is just one Markov blanket and there are no internal states. So we're talking about things that don't have active states. They just have sensory states, for example. So we're talking about rocks, inert things. But then if you equip certain other natural kinds with an active set of outputs or active states, equip that Markov blanket with an active sector, then the thing can act upon the world and it can move. So now we move to animate kinds of things. And then we move now to systems which I think are really interesting, which mean that there are actually Markov blankets on the inside, which induces a kind of hierarchical structure on the inside, which means that certain parts of the inside of your animate thing don't have direct access to the active states. And this introduces a really interesting description of these kinds of things. And I'm talking about things like you and me. Things like you and me can always be described as inferring the causes of their sensations. But now I've just said that we can no longer observe our own actions. So our actions now become a hidden cause of our own sensations. So now I can always describe you as inferring your own behavior. And this is known as planning. And I think that would give you this is part of this complexity arms race I was talking about before, that as we have to deal with more and more complicated environments or worlds, we move up from inanimate things to animate things, autonomous things, and then from there we move up to what has been called strange things for particular reasons, that now are equipped with a generative model of their own behavior. So now you get a certain a recursion and a self modeling of your greater or lesser sophistication, which I think you could apply to multicellular organisms, but probably not cellular organisms. Why?
Okay.
Well, simply because the single cellular organism doesn't really have those nested Markov blankets on the inside. Now, some people might argue that mitochondria could constitute this, and there could be some sense in which the mitochondria are planning. But the cell, a single cell, would probably not have the capacity, or could not be described as having a very deep or hierarchically structured generative model of the sort that you would need to be described as engaging in intentional behavior. And I use intentional behavior in the sense that to plan towards something in the future means you have some intended outcome in the future. So I don't think a single cell could have intentional behavior, but it could certainly have very complicated, very functional behavior. Um, you know, um, you know, I- you know, of the kind that you'd expect a really smart thermostat to have, for example.
Right. Okay, let's move.
Multicellular. Sorry.
That's great. It's good for us to understand because we talk about the fractal nature of this work, and it has limitations. And we would like to think that when we look at a team of people or an organization, you could put a boundary around them and think of them as having sensory inputs or sensory states and actions, and maybe a similar generative model. Is that true? Is that possible?
Can I, just pick up because I didn't speak to your notion of a fractal organization. I think that's a really important observation as well. So I would read fractal here as um, a statement that there is some self-similarity that comes for free with this scale invariance that you get, and literally it becomes scale-free in a network, and that is exactly this sort of deep structure I was talking about. So,
Okay.
it is, the fractal, the self-similar, and the scale invariant aspects of the organization of something, be it an institution or a person or possibly even a cell, I think is a really important aspect of or feature which will determine the nature of your engagement with the world.
Thank you. That's huge. So, for our listeners, at the moment, I added sensory states and active states on the left side of the rectangle. On the boundary, I added sensory states, and on the right side of the rectangle, I added active states. Sensory states on the left, active states on the right. Please walk us through what these are, Karl.
Right. So the sensory states, I repeat, sort of mathematically, they're just defined in terms of their causal power in relation to the internal and external states, and they're just those kinds of states that can change and influence the dynamics of the internal states, but that is not reciprocated. So it's this, if you like, a lack of influence, this sparsity, sometimes called loose coupling in dynamical systems theory, which renders them sensory states, and in an exactly symmetrical way, the active states reach out into the outside, into the external states, and have causal power in terms of changing the dynamics, is by moving things, for example. But that again is a unidirectional influence. Then that influence is not reciprocated. So the outside world cannot change the way in which you move. It is you that is doing the moving. So,
Okay.
to give some sort of concrete examples of this, we can be very concrete, and we can say that we can take a single cell, for example, and say, well, what are the sensory states of a single cell? Well, they're basically the cell surface. Or you could be more restrictive and sort of assign the sensory receptors on the cell surface as registering the sensory, as being the sensory states. And in single cell organisms, interestingly, the active states actually just lie underneath the surface, and they push the surface, the sensory states, into the environment. And because they're hiding behind the sensory states, that means the environment, the outside world, cannot affect them. They are so fulfilling the Markov blanket or Markov boundary condition. And then the internal states are those which influence the active states that push the sensory states out into the environment, and the sensory states register what's going on in the local external milieu. That's not the kind of arrangement that you and I have, though. For us, our active states would be all our actuators, our autonomic reflexes. By actuators, I mean our muscles.
Mm-hmm.
So we're only equipped with relatively limited numbers or number of ways of changing our world. We're only animate in a very restricted way. So if you think about it, the only way that you can actually change the universe is by moving or secreting something. And that's all you can do.
Okay.
Which means that you're just looking for your effector organs that are going to contract a muscle or secrete something.
Let me ask you this. On sensory states, your eyes, your ears, your skin, your mouth, all those could be sensory organs, right? But when you observe something, don't you change what you're observing?
Well, yeah, another great question. So that is, of course, active vision. It's a splendid example of active inference. Yeah. So just to reiterate what you were saying, so all of our 5 plus senses are understood in terms of sensory states being the sensory epithelia with which we are born, which we are equipped with, and a really important example of that. Those sensory epithelia are the retina, that line the back of our eye, and register light that's coming in. And then we try to make sense of what could have caused that. Is it a face? Is it a bird? Is it a leaf? Whatever. But what you've brought to the table with that question is the crucial closure of that circular causality across the Markov blanket. It matters where my sensory epithelia is pointing. So I've got little muscles in my eye, the ocular motor system, that can now become a really potent cause of what I am sensing with my eyes. So this then leads you into a really important part of cognitive neuroscience, which is visual search. So how do we survey a scene? How do we use our eyes, our vision, to make sense of the environment in which we find ourselves? And that one way of expressing that is to see is to look. To look is to actually position your eyes and attend to the right part of the visual field in a very active way. So the sensory epithelia, the sensory states, register the consequences or the influences of the world. You can think of this as like data. They harvest data. But because you can act, you can now choose what data to sample that's going to be most efficacious in inferring what is the cause of what's going on. So, for example, if I see some flickering in the periphery of my vision out of the corner of my eye, I am actively going to look over there by moving my eyes in order to resolve uncertainty about what I was actually looking at. So this is part of this sort of action perception cycle, this loop that I was referring to before, depends upon this fast exchange across the Markov blanket. From the point of view of fintech or say modeling financial markets, what that would mean is you don't need big data, you need smart data. You need the data that will resolve uncertainty that you have at the moment about what caused these particular, or the state of affairs out there, the state of the market, for example. So being equipped with active inference and active vision in the context of visual search means that you are now in a position to very selectively use your sensory epithelia, use your sensory states actively in a way that you go and sample the world in the right kind of way to build a generative model of that world that is as parsimonious and as efficient as it can be.
We'll probably come back to that financial market example here in a little bit. I want to move on to adding what emerges out of sensory states and moves towards the generative model, and what moves out of the generative model. In this case, we have it going back towards sensory states. It's still internal to the agent or within the boundary. So we have a light blue line there. I think it's surprise, or we call them sensory signals. Can you talk a little bit about what emerges or what is sent from our sensory organs or sensory states to our generative model? What would you call that?
Well, there are a number of ways of describing that. I think probably the most intuitive one is that afforded by a predictive coding formulation. And what that simply means is that if you make some simplifying assumptions about the nature of the entropy and the randomness and the other aspects of itinerancy of a fast kind you had on the first slide, if you assume that they're well behaved and Gaussian, you can now formulate the message passing implicit in the cyan and the blue arrows in terms of broadcasting prediction errors that will drive updates in your generative model that will reciprocate with particular predictions. So in this view of active inference, which is I repeat, has a particular commitment to a predictive coding formulation, what you're saying is all the sensory flux or flow through the sensory sector of my Markov blanket provides me with news, information about the states of affairs out there that are hidden from me that I have to actually infer.
Did you say news or new
news,
information? Okay.
News. Okay. I'm using an Andy Clark intuition here. So then the question is, what is the newsworthy information? Well, the newsworthy information is that which you didn't predict. That's why we watch the news on our social media, or the news at 10 on television. It's stuff that we can't predict. So that's the prediction error. So technically, it's simply the difference between what we're actually sensing and what we predicted we would sense in this moment. Okay. And the difference between the prediction of what we'd sense and the actual sensation is the prediction error. And that's the newsworthy part. And that is a part that's passed back into the generative model, into this usually a hierarchy of internal states that then plays the role of a generative model. Because if you just think through what I've just said, in order to create a prediction error, I have to have a prediction. Mm-hmm. So my generative model has to furnish a prediction of what I would see. So the generative model holds in mind, effectively, or can be described as holding in mind, a putative explanation, an hallucination, a fantasy, a hypothesis about the cause of my sensations. And if my generative model can then generate a prediction on what or what I would see if my hypothesis was correct, and that's basically the blue line that you've got here, I can use that prediction to subtract it from the sensations, just leaving what I didn't predict, and that's the prediction error. And then I'm going to use that prediction error, which would be the cyan line, to drive my hypotheses to a better explanation. And this technically would be known as Bayesian belief updating. Okay. So, I think that's, that would be another example of this sort of, recurrent message passing and internal loops that are driving, in this instance, just making sense of the sensory states. I'm just wondering, how I noted before you talked about perceptual control theory, so this might be a nice point to slip that in if that was.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
So at the moment, your active states are sort of hanging outside this purely perceptual loop. And the perceptual loop we're talking about now is the recurrent message passing on the inside with these prediction errors going deep into the internal states, deep into the generative model.
Let's do this, Karl. Let's come back to that in a moment. I think we'll come to perception here in a moment. I think it'll make more sense on perception action. We've had Warren Mansfield on the podcast to talk about that, and I think I think what we're drawing here, or sketching here, connects to that as well. So let's put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that. But I do have a couple questions on what we're looking at now. So you brought up Bayesian updating. We talk about the Bayesian brain. Is this, when we talk about predictive processing, Bayesian brain, is it just this part, or is there more we need to explore before we can say the Bayesian updating happening in the brain?
I think if we're just looking at the sort of the use of the way that the brain uses sensory states to make sense of the world,
Hmm.
I think that is a perfectly sufficient to say, yes, this is um, covered by the Bayesian brain hypothesis. Um,
Okay.
but you'd have to qualify that because there's no action yet. So
No
we're
action. We
just
haven't seen
talking,
action, right?
yeah. So we're just talking about sense making and perception, and I think it is perfectly fair to say that um, you know, predictive coding is one particular implementation of the Bayesian brain when deployed to understand perception and sense making, and that just requires a sort of recurrent exchange of predictions and prediction errors of your internal states that entail this generative model and the sensory states in exactly the way you've drawn it here. And I said before that these prediction errors are newsworthy part of the sensory information
Mhm.
drives um, um, changes your mind by driving hypotheses or expectations to provide better predictions to eliminate the prediction error or reduce the surprise. That drive mathematically is called Bayesian belief updating. You're literally
Okay.
sort of driving or changing your hypotheses to better fit the sensory data.
I think our friends on Wall Street are going to love this conversation because they use a lot of Bayesian updating to do work on their models. Let's move on to this. So let's get to the active part. I did skip over variational free energy just in the interest of time. We may come back to that. So the way we understand it is, and you just alluded to it, is there, prior to this slide, there was no action, right? So we have an internal action loop and an external action loop, external to the boundary, to the Markov blanket. Can we talk about the orange pathway that in this case goes from active states and points back to sensory states? It's still internal to the system. Can you tell us what's behind that?
Right. So, so we're now moving into the more interesting world where we're now, searching for the right sensations, and we're deploying our sensory epithelium, our sense organs in the right kind of way. We're doing smart data mining, if you like. But to do that, we have to move our eyes. So we have to um, think about the mechanics of how we actually engage our um, um, active states or our actuators. Um, Perhaps the simplest way of thinking about this is from the point of view either of homeostasis or more simply from the point of view of, say, a thermostat. If you want a thermostat to do something like switch a heater on or off, with a um, with the agenda of keeping the sensory states within viable bounds, so that the sensory state here would be a thermoreceptor of some kind, then the thermostat, all you need to do is to tell the switch on the radiator um, or um, the temperature, the thermoreceptor, what is its desired point? What is its set point? And if you can specify the set point for a thermostat, then you can just compare the desired set point temperature with the actual sensed temperature. And when there is a deviation in one direction or the other, then you just engage your actuators, which will be the red line here, to actually turn on the radiator, for example, or turn it off. So I'm phrasing that in a way which should be sympathetic to perceptual control theory. So what we're saying is,
Got it.
if we can specify an active engagement with the world in terms of the preferred or predicted consequences of that action, we can now just use our motor, our muscle reflexes, like a knee-jerk reflex, for example, or on the inside, autonomic reflexes, to make that prediction come true. And this
Okay.
is how we actually work.
Well, how about this? Two questions. First question is an individual doing some mental rehearsal simulation. Would that be what this pathway is here, the orange pathway? Some type of planning, some type of simulation?
Um, Certainly, if you mean rehearsal in the sense of simulating an imaginal counterfactual future,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a gift in very complicated things. I don't think that mitochondria or single cells will do that, but certainly you and I do that. And most high-life forms
So people that are in peak performance and thinking through their complicated world of performance may actually run that simulation. It could also be dreams too, right? I mean, that low fidelity dream that is being projected internally, when I'm sleeping, could that be represented by the orange line?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of those things they actually speak to, uh, I think, a really interesting but slightly orthogonal issue, which is rendering your generative model as efficient as possible. Um, so that sort of mental rehearsal of an elite athlete um, spending much of their lived day physically doing what they do so expertly, but also just rehearsing it in their head. These are examples of maximizing the efficiency of the model. Mathematically, this would be sort of minimizing the free energy or maximizing the marginal likelihood or the evidence, evidence for your model, that entail um, a um, a minimization of the complexity required to perform accurately.
Hmm.
And things like sleep and introspection and mental rehearsal of this sort are thought by some, and most people in my field, to be the process by which we maximize the efficiency of our generative models by removing spurious or redundant aspects to it so that we become habitized and very, very efficient, pursuing mathematically paths of least action. That when we actually deploy that generative model to predict how we're actually going to move or behave, it's much more efficient and incidentally will also generalize to slightly novel or new situations.
Another scenario. So the three of us are portfolio managers working on the same team. We can kind of think of this orange pathway as a risk management. I believe you call it expected free energy. We're trying to reduce that in the future. So as long as we don't take any external action, if we kind of talk about what we want to do in the market tomorrow or next week or whenever that may be, we're actually rehearsing something that is within our blanket. If you put a blanket around the three of us, right? So can we think of expected free energy as a way or minimizing expected free energy as a way of risk management?
Yeah, well, I mean, literally, absolutely. So you've jumped straight into expected free energy, which was which was courageous of you. We haven't even done variational free energy, but perhaps we don't need to because you can certainly. So if you just look at the physics of this, it is the case that these self-organizing systems that have this um, deep structure, these deep generative models, literally in the spirit of deep learning that you see in things like transformer architectures and large language models. If they have this deep structure and they have the capacity to infer the consequences of their action, um, then that tells you something really important because the consequences of the action are in the future because they haven't yet happened, which immediately tells you we're talking about a very special kind of generative model that is future pointing. So anything that you generate in the context of simulating the consequences of your action is exactly what you were describing. It is rehearsal on the inside because the
Okay.
consequences have not yet happened. And this, of course, can be described as planning. It can be described as optimizing your policy, strategizing, um,
Hmm.
selecting among the best path into the future. What's the best path into the future? Well, it's the one that either minimizes the expected prediction error if I did this or I did that. Um, another way of reading that is it minimizes the expected surprise. And that expected surprise comes in two flavors. It could be read as um, uh, as uncertainty. So I'm always going to act and move and indeed rehearse all the possible ways of strategizing or policy optimizing in a way that maximizes the information gain or minimizes my uncertainty. So this would be an example of, I said before, I would look over there to see what caused this flickering in the corner of my eye. That would be purely driven by this aspect of expected free energy, which is the expected information gain. There's another kind of surprise, which is the cost of some outcome, which would be very surprising for me, for being a very low temperature, being very poor, having a massive drawdown if I was a portfolio management. So those two aspects of surprise minimization in the future underwrite the expected free energy. But crucially, you can rearrange the terms of the expected information gain and the expected cost, negative expected utility, to read as risk and ambiguity. So in choosing the rehearsed or counterfactual policy that minimizes the expected free energy, that is mathematically the same as choosing that which minimizes risk and also minimizes ambiguity. And mathematically, the risk here is a measure. I have to say, it's, mathematically, it's called a Ki divergence or a relative entropy. So, it's a long words for something which is actually very simple and easy to compute. It's just the difference between what I expect to happen if I do this, if I make, say, this investment, and what I would consider to be the most likely kind of outcome for the kind of thing that I am, sometimes written down as your prior preferences. So if I think I'm a portfolio manager that is going to have a very, very reasonable, thank you, rate of return with a Sharpe ratio of, say, 2, and I am not going to incur a negative rate of return. I'll have some drawdown on my investment. Then I have some very precise priors about the kind of thing I am, and then I can say, well, if I did this, probabilistically under my generative model, what would happen? And is that close to what I think I am? And that degree of closeness now is the inverse risk, or the measure of the distance between what I anticipate will happen if I did that and what I would prefer to happen, is the risk. So risk minimization, literally in an economics context, now becomes installed into this expected surprise or expected free energy. So another way of stating that is a first principle account of self-organization naturally surfaces risk as one of the key imperatives for sustainable behavior.
That's such a better definition than the wide use of just volatility as being risk.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that volatility induces uncertainty, which again pushes apart these probabilistic beliefs about it. So volatility is a really important aspect of what gets into this risk assessment effectively that you're doing during your rehearsals.
So there might be a special case here. I want to bring it up, and I'll do this slowly. So the red pathway commits to external action. That action perturbs the environment and generates new sensory signals. So if you think about some of the most adaptive agents, maybe in combat and markets and surgery, they may deliberately choose an action that will generate maximum surprise. So we're talking about novelty seeking here, or something, maybe in that case. Is there a special case for this in the active inference and world?
Again, a great question. Yeah, absolutely. And it allows me to sort of dispel a particular myth about surprise. So very often you say all your sense making, if you remember the cyan and the blue arrows of the previous slide, is in the service of minimizing prediction errors, minimizing surprise. But that's a sensory surprise. I mean, you want to minimize that. That's the variation free energy. But when it comes to action, you want to maximize surprise. And this kind of surprise, this type of surprise, called Bayesian surprise. And it is this that scores the information gain. it is exactly this kind of surprise that drives behavior, that explains information-seeking, curious behavior, novelty-seeking behavior. So the surprise, you want to minimize sensory surprise in perception, but when now planning your next move, choosing what to do, deciding what the best, predicting your active states effectively, then you want to maximize Bayesian surprise. You want to maximize that information gain. So if you remember before, I was trying to say, if you rearrange the terms, so you can write this down mathematically, you've got 3 terms in play, and you can sort of you can arrange them in 2 ways. You can either bunch these 2 together, and that becomes risk, and that becomes ambiguity, or you can bunch these 2 together, and this becomes expected information gain, which is the minimizing uncertainty. It drives the curiosity, and the one that's left is the expected utility or negative expected cost that you get again in economics. So economics has all exactly the right sort of terminology and the right rhetoric that maps beautifully onto various decompositions of this expected free energy.
So I'm starting to see the real value of this on Wall Street, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So if the math is there, and we have a process that and we'll talk about a process here in a moment, this changes how things could work on Wall Street, and I think we'll come back to that here in a moment. I'm going to move on to 2 things here. We talked about ecological psychology, ecological dynamics, constraints-led approach. We've had folks on the show talk about these things, and there's a place I'm going with this. So in this image at the moment, I have a pink arrow moving out of the generative model back towards sensory states, and that represents perception. That's that Anil Seth's approach of perception is top-down, inside-out. It's a controlled hallucination. And I have a green arrow that moves in the opposite direction, and that moves towards active states. All these are internal to the boundary. So basically what I have here is a perception action loop, and we talked about that earlier. Can you talk a little bit about both perception and even your work with Kotler and Menino on intuition? I think you guys talked about type 0, type 1 cognition.
Yes. Yeah, there are a number of ways that we could take this. I think probably the most useful dialectic or distinction probably pertains to the distinction between sort of reflexive behavior and intentional behavior. I know it's not quite what you were driving at, and you'll have to guide me back to speak to what you were talking about. But if you have in mind a distinction between reflexive behavior of the kind that Warren Mansell would have been very fluent talking about in the context of perceptual control theory, where I just need to quickly and in a fast and frugal way, as people like Gigerenz would say, equip my actuators, the things that I actually use to move around, with the right set points. Or more specifically, equip my perceptual apparatus with the right set points, and then let the reflexes do the job of making that come true. Then you're talking about something that doesn't need to do this planning that we're talking about. You don't need expected free energy here. You can do all of this with the variational free energy and do it fast and reflexively in a very, very efficient way. So that this is what a skilled athlete would be driving towards. So they don't have to think about it. So it's system 1 versus system 2 thinking, basically. And on the other hand, we've just been talking about deliberative thinking, planning, rehearsing into the future, evaluating different policies, and looking at the different ways of that evaluation in terms of expected utility and risk and ambiguity and expected information gain, all different perspectives on the same, on the same underlying quantity. But that's a very different kind of thinking. Now imagine that you've got the opportunity to do this sort of long-range forecasting in your head, contingent upon one of a small number of policies, or
Right.
possibly a large number of policies, and then you're picking the policy that conforms to the risk minimization, ambiguity minimization, or the maximum information gain and expected utility. Imagine now that you can contextualize how far into the future you go. So you can actually now contextualize whether I actually need to think a lot about this, or whether I know exactly what to do in the next moment by shrinking that time horizon down and just responding reflexively. So that you've now got an opportunity, and I'm thinking here more of the work on things like flow, for example. Being in the flow means you're not planning into the distant future. So being in the flow, if you're a skilled mountain climber, for example, means you are not thinking about which restaurant you're going to go to when you get off the mountain.
Right.
You are in the moment. And that basically means that the future is no longer part of your generative model. You're just choosing the very next thing to do, very much like a thermostat, or very much like a small insect would do. Acutely, fast, frugal, knows exactly what it is, exactly what to do next, and doesn't have to worry about the future. There's no uncertainty about the long-term future. So I think that, perhaps one way of associating the distinction between the pink and the green arrows would be to sort of just go back to Kahneman's system 1, system 2 distinction, but read in this instance as something that is much more reflexive. Some people call this mere active inference. So you're not now talking about the planning aspect, the risk and ambiguity ways of scoring the consequence of this plan or this policy. You're now immediately just responding in a way that you have always responded. And interestingly, what tends to happen if you simulate these things is that initially you start off with the green arrow. You start off with a deliberative thinking your way through the problem. What would happen if I did this? And is this the best thing to do? And then choosing the most likely thing to do, given you are the kind of thing you are. And then you see yourself doing this time and time and time again, which brings us back to the elite athlete, rehearsing time and time again. If you see yourself doing exactly the same thing and in exactly the same situation, then you will slowly habitize and learn that. So you'll actually go from a sort of system 2 kind of thinking to a system 1 kind of immediate, fast, frugal response. And I imagine that's probably another perspective on the importance of not so much dreaming in this instance or introspection, but just repeatedly doing the same thing time and time again until you totally habitize it effectively.
So I want to go to perception in a moment. I want to stay on the green pathway, we're calling it perception, intuition, and process. And the reason I'm calling it a process is if we scale up to a team and the three of us are on a team and we have good understanding of a process of how to plan, meaning we reduce the energy required to figure out how to go through a planning process before simulation. I want to point out something here that process feeds back down into here, right? So we can actually run the simulation, right? So it doesn't go external to the environment right away. We can, if we put the boundary around us, we run an effective approach to planning. I'll just say that. That's another way I look at that is we can run that simulation. And going back to your elite athlete, they have the reflexive approach to understanding how to triple jump or run a play or whatever it may be. I think they call it habits of mind. We don't call it muscle memory anymore. I think that's gone. But they have this reflexive capability and they can simulate it internally to improve future performance, right? So that's kind of what we're doing here, both at the individual level and at a team level is we haven't done anything out in the environment yet, right? We're just we're keeping it internal. And that's where I'm kind of thinking how this scales up towards a team. And now I'm going to switch over to perception. I'll let you comment on both here in a moment. So perception, the way we understand it is perception emerges out of something. And it actually controls what we sense, right? Or I think it does. It may filter what we allow into our system. And I'm talking us as humans at the moment. Can you comment on that and help us understand all that a little bit better? Making sure we're not lying to anybody.
No, you're not lying. No, that was very nicely put. Yeah, absolutely. So, in fact, it couldn't be any other way. So, sorry, I'm talking about the importance of on the inside passing back the consequences of your plans to the registered sensed outcomes. It couldn't be any other way, because if you just think about it, deploying these ideas as in the context of, say, neurodevelopment, I said before that the way that you measure risk is to use the difference between what I think will happen if I do this versus what I a priori expect to happen given the kind of thing I am. So I'm not talking about sort of declarative or propositional beliefs. I'm talking about just the way I am built. So these are subpersonal. Um, this is read at a subpersonal level. Exactly the same thing applies to an infant. But how can you tell an infant what it prefers? The only thing you can tell it is basically the preferred sensory states, the preferred observations. Why? Because at this point, it hasn't got a generative model. It doesn't know that there is an opportunity to suckle at the mother's breast. It doesn't know there's an opportunity in later life to make friends at kindergarten. It just hasn't got these representations. So you can't specify these prior preferences, these innate preferences, the thing you need for your homeostasis in the space of the latent states that is the realm or the domain of generative model. So it has to be in the sensory states. Yeah. So you have to specify your preferences in the currency of your sensory observations. And that basically means you can only evaluate the quality of a particular plan once you project it back into that sensory space, that outcome space. So that what has now become a green arrow on the inside is an essential part of this risk evaluation. So you actually, the probability distributions I was talking about before over the anticipated given an action and the prior preferences that define the kind of investor or person or infant I am or phenotype that I am. That probabilistic those are probability distributions that are compared against each other, and that has to be done in the future on the inside in order to evaluate the quality or the risk associated with any given policy. Those probability distributions crucially are over the outputs, they're over the consequences of your behavior. We're talking about rate of return before, for example. So you can only specify your preferences about the consequences that you actually observe, which is how much money you make or lose if you're the kind of thing that would qualify as a portfolio manager, for example.
Okay. Just in the interest of time, we've got a lot of questions we want to get to. I'm going to continue to build here. So predictive versus prospective control. I want to talk about this briefly. You co-authored a paper that lays out the different accounts of anticipatory behavior. And you wrote this with some of the folks who've been on the show, Dr. Ippolito, Bray, Warren, and yourself, and I think a few others. So my view on this, and I think Mark's view on this as well, is what we just drew encompasses what ecological psychology says happens when somebody's throwing a baseball at, towards their kid, that they don't have to think about it. It's just the affordances in the environment. We talk about constant bearing, decreasing range in fighter aviation. That's how we know we're going to hit something and or catch it. So is it possible that these all work together in models, or can you talk a bit more about the conflict between predictive and prospective control?
Yeah, and I'm going to read it, in the way that you've set up the slide. I've set up the question because I haven't heard it put like that before, but I think it's an excellent way to put it. So the predictive aspect, I think, would be very consistent with a perceptual control theoretic perspective. It would be the mere active inference. It would be the system one reflexive kind of response, which would only involve very fast and frugal, what Gigerenzer would call heuristics, that are entailed just by engaging state action policies, so that immediately I see this, I infer this state of affairs, and therefore I know exactly what I'm going to do, because this is the kind of thing I am, and I will send my set points down to my sensory epithelium and let my reflexes do all the rest. And obviously the example here is I only need to expect to see my hand decrease the angular disparity between my hand and the ball, for example.
Right.
And I don't need to deliberate about that. I don't need to think about that. Then, I could write down a machine to do this, very quickly and very, very efficiently. And that's the exact opposite of what we're talking about in terms of this ability to plan, to think through the consequences in a prospective way. What will happen in a few seconds' time or a minute's time if I do this or do that? So the distinction here, I think, between the predictive and the prospective control is that the prospective control takes you outside the radical inactivism and perceptual control theory. There's no room in perceptual control theory for people who actually think about the consequences of their actions in the distant future. And that's the system two kind of thinking where you get this risk and ambiguity on the expected free energy in play. So active inference is not in the radical inactivism camp. It does certainly accommodate 99% or acknowledge that 99% of the way we actually move and engage with the world is beautifully described by perceptual control theory. If you're an engineer, this will be known as model predictive control. If you're a physicist, it would also be known as KL, path integral control. These are the standard ways in which you build robots, in which you build drone interceptors and the like. And that's a really efficient way of doing it. But that doesn't work in a more complicated situation where you've got a number of alternative paths into the future. That means you now have to choose or select among a number of alternative paths into the future. And that future I'm associating with the word prospective control. That now requires this risk sensitive or path integral control or KL control or model predictive control that has the ability to choose between a number of counterfactual futures. So at this point, that's what I meant by intentional behavior. That I intend this kind of outcome, and I've selected this particular plan into the policy into the future over another one. The predictive control doesn't have that option. There's only one path into the future, and that's the path of least action or maximum efficiency or minimum effort or maximum likelihood. And that's has a great efficiency, and it is perfectly okay when the system doesn't have has a certain kind of short-term predictability. But in other situations where where your actions have consequence in the long term that need to be predicted, then we have to move to this this more sort of prospective kind of planning as inference. If you can, an insect wouldn't have the choice. An insect would just do this kind of predictive control. But you and I have a choice. We can either be in the flow and do the predictive control, or we can stop and think about things and deliberate on what's the best thing to do. And that would be much more of a prospective control.
Well, we're big fans of flow, so we like that green pathway. Okay, let's kind of connect everything, and we'll get into some good questions here. This has been fascinating, and I think we can go on for about 10 more hours if you had that much time. We won't do that to you. Okay, so here we have the overall drawing. We have a fitness landscape, an environment full of hidden states. Are they called noumenal? Is it? Am I using that word right? In the environment?
I think you are. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
The phenomenon of the noumenal. Yeah, that's very Kantian of you. Again, you know more about this than I do.
Oh, no, no, no. We're still learning here. So here we have the boundary, the Markov blanket. We have it separating the agent from that environment. We have the sensory states on the left. We have the active states on the right, sending actions out. We have a generative model doing Bayesian inference, sending predictions down, receiving prediction errors up from the sensory states, I believe. We have the active inference cycles, if you want to call that, one internal, one external. And we have two implicit pathways, and that's what we're calling them, that pink arrow and that green arrow. One being that perception, that's we're calling that pink one, and then we're calling that green one more of that intuition, that type 0, type 1 cognition you worked out with Kotler. I want to share something with you. I'm going to build something up, and this is the surprise for you. And here comes the build. This is actually what we call the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. This is what John Boyd gave us, and I'm going to let Mark talk a little bit more about that. So this actually exists, but most people don't know anything about it, right? They turn it into a linear thing. They go OODA, right? They think the OODA loop is as simple as first you observe, then you orient, then you decide, and then you act. What we just accomplished in this hour and 20 minutes that we've been together is to show them that's not how this works, right? We have so much more behind this that we believe this is I'm going to use the phrase, a weapon system, a way to understand how living systems engage with a changing environment. And unfortunately, a lot of folks go out in the world and they share the linear version. We believe that the work that John Boyd did, which includes looking at cybernetics, Gödel's theorem, Heisenberg uncertainty principle. He looked at mysticism. He looked at quantum physics. I'm not going to get I don't go through a lot of detail there, but he was on the same pathway that you're on. And I believe what you did is you actually formalized the maths behind all this, the math behind it, right? And to me, that means that you're on the right path. I mean, the folks that are looking at this are on the right path. Karl, question to you. Have you ever seen the OODA loop or heard anybody talk about it?
I've heard people talk about it, but I haven't. Forgive me. I'm somewhat colloquial in my expertise, and I don't quite have the breadth of your scholarship. But that seems very convincing. And interestingly, that's exactly why I had that second allergy to the notion of flow. So this notion that things are just flowing from left to right. That's exactly what I was trying to counter, and in exactly the way that you're describing a misconception of the OODA loop. There's lots of sort of the current circular causality of a cybernetic sort on the inside. Yeah.
I want to point out one thing on the left here and ask you a question, and I'm going to turn over to Mark for a lot of questions. But on the left, we didn't have this earlier. We had we have unfolding circumstances, which we believe is coming from other agents that are trying to maximize our surprise. So if we're competing, we want to create mismatches for others, right? That increases surprise while minimizing our surprise. But there's another one here, outside information. You've been working with Michael Levin. I've seen you on some of the podcasts there about Platonic Space. Can you spend a couple minutes on talking about what Platonic Space is and how it relates to the free energy principle and active inference?
Well, the agenda that Mike's pursuing is trying to find sort of a first principle account of self-organization, which would be apt at many, to use your word fractal, but certainly in a scale invariant way. And looking towards theoreticians and mathematicians to try and find that these sort of I hesitate to call them that because I could get into trouble, but sort of Platonic structures that explain self-organization in an ensemble, in a multi-agent setting, in a multicellular setting, in a scale-free setting. So it's interesting you brought in now the notion of different two active inference agents talking to each other, or perhaps a community of active inference agents, which then have their own Markov blanket, and then you get Markov blankets of Markov blankets. I say that because I think the intersection or the connection between Mike's Platonic program and the free energy principle is exactly the application of the principles of the free energy principle at multiple scales in a scale invariant or self-similar fashion. I think that's the key to the nature. That's the right maths that Mike is searching for.
Okay.
That everything is contextualized by the scale above. And this becomes incredibly important when you're thinking about communities of things, whether they're cells or whether they're investors or whether they're populations, whether they're communities exchanging via social media, and the formation of Markov blankets at different scales. The formation of in-groups versus out-groups. So I think that's probably the point of connection, which I imagine you probably want to explore. With,
yeah. I'd like to know if we can keep you for at least 20 more minutes. Is that possible? At least?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I do want to get into markets. I want to talk a little bit more about flow, briefly on psychedelics, AI, and consciousness. I know that's about 6 hours right there.
Yeah.
But before I do that, I want to turn it over to Moose and just check in with him to see what.
I just wanted to go. I wanted to go back to the sketch, Ponch, and get Karl's take on it, because there is so much overlap when we look at the sketch, and this is what he called it. He only drew it once. I mean, we Ponch and I have seen all the various iterations of this inside of the archives. But this particular version was done around 1995, right before he passed in 1997. And of course, we wonder what would have happened had he lived a little longer than age 70. But when we look at that sketch, the generative model in the middle is what he called orientation. And it's shaped by our genetic heritage, our cultural traditions, our previous experience, new information, etc. And if you'll notice, kind of back to your point about why you'd shirk away from flow, because things just don't go in a circle, and why we go away from the reductionist model of Boyd's work, because there are so many arrows pointed in so many directions on this sketch, including inside the generative model. All of those things, if you look closely, they're all pointing to each other's as if they were firing off simultaneously as they interact with reality outside of their boundary. In the other place, we could send you over the brief, but his primary collaborator was a guy called Chuck Spinney, and he has a deck called The Evolutionary Epistemology of John Boyd's Destruction and Creation. And when he draws the OODA loop, he includes inside of the graphic, you see the boundary. Now, he doesn't have it quite as a Markov blanket, but you see the green area, the green shaded area on the right-hand side, the graphic. First of all, you can see the contrast between the reductionist garbage consulting circular OODA loop, which does not account for complexity. It doesn't account for all the other things that Boyd put into this. As Ponch mentioned, it was a very interdisciplinary thing: cybernetics, warfare, history, philosophy, everything, quantum, entropy. And his core destruction and creation was that we're constantly breaking and shattering and revising that generative model, because it shapes how we sense. It shapes our sensory states. That's what he called our observations. So whereas you say the sensory states, and then the active states, that was the test to Boyd for a hypothesis, which would be the decision. And what people have done with this is they've reduced it to the point where it talks about, well, I'm in this phase and I go to this phase and I go to this phase. But we know that complexity is not linear, and Boyd knew that. And Boyd never said that it was. And Boyd drew it this way very specifically. And I think it really, what we get in this part that we spent the last hours going over, is that there's a beautiful synergy and affirmation of what he was actually pursuing, completely autodidactically. I mean, this was a man that was doing all of this and coming up with it in his free time, if he had that. They had any free time. But that's the result, and that's why with us, this is why active inference and the free energy, that's why it resonates so much, And it's nice to see that all of the mathematical backing and everything, because I think at a minimum, we could argue that Boyd inherently understood this, that he implicitly understood this on how complex adaptive systems interact with their environment.
So did he actually use the words hypothesis and test for those two?
He did, yes. When he drew out the sketch, he did use those exact terms. Because, which by the way, to your point, just to say that shatters the linear reduction of it, because decision in that, if I frame it that way, a decision is not a hypothesis. It's just part of a step that I phase through in a circular fashion. But yes, he did use hypothesis.
Yeah, that's my favorite way of thinking about the free energy principle. This is, I talked about inference to the best explanation, but, you could equally frame that in terms of hypothesis testing. So all my active engagement in the world is just soliciting the right observations that enable me to disambiguate and test my hypotheses.
Yes.
So this is isomorphic with active inference.
Yes, that's what Ponch and I have been. Ponch is the one that showed me this stuff, and it clicked with me, clearly. And of course our thinking develops and evolves as Boyd would have wanted. The one other part I would point out is that is the area where it says implicit guidance and control, because that's the second part. So when we talk about explaining John Boyd's OODA loop sketch, we talk about that generative model, the orientation. It starts there. That in turn shapes or implicitly guides and controls how we make sense of our environment, and in some cases, how we act. There's certain things that I can do because I've done it so many times, like catch a baseball or throw a baseball. I don't have to go through any type of a linear thinking process to know how to do that. It becomes inherent to me, so that my energy expenditure is actually lower, because my orientation, which is attuned to that, implicitly guides and controls how I would act. How I would do something. Same thing in how I would sense something, even intuitively. My orientation is so well attuned to the environment, through my previous experience, through the unfolding circumstances, to how I break things down and put things back together with novelty, that I can sense things and feel things faster and have a lower energy expenditure, because the implicit guidance and control is my orientation through implicit guidance and control is shaping how I see things. And if I can do that faster than my competitors, or faster than the rate of change, that's what Boyd said would give me the capacity for free and independent action. That was ultimately what he said in his core document, his core doctrine, which would be called destruction and creation. The reason that we break all these things down and revise and update is to implicitly guide, control, and shape, to increase or to rather improve our capacity for free and independent action. So the more attuned we are, then the faster we can get, and the faster we can get, that we can defeat our competition. But it's in no way limited to competition. But that's just one application of it.
Yeah. Just to sort of endorse that. So in my world, much of my thinking inherits from Helmholtz, obviously, but also how you write down the maths in the form of Richard Feynman. So the variation of free energy is the one that Richard Feynman used, and it is finding the path of least action. It is exactly what you just said. It's finding the most efficient path in virtue of the action being time times energy. So if you find the path of least action, you are effectively doing the same thing efficiently quicker, or doing it with less energy. That is the definition of the path of least action, which is why it's called a variational principle of least action, the free energy principle. It's also you also mentioned free and independent action, so it's quite nice. It's got free and action in the same sentence, which is of course one statement of the free energy principle is actually a principle of at least free action.
Well, we'll send you the paper, Destruction and Creation, because that's what we find when we interact with people that reduce his understanding and what he actually taught, the authentic version of what it was that he's teaching. We find in most cases, not only have they never read Destruction and Creation, they don't understand it. And I know when you read it, you'll look at it, you'll see it it'll click, and you'll see the sources that he had, like Popper and Polanyi and even Alan Watts. I mean, it was pulling from an extremely interdisciplinary approach of how we make sense of our world by shattering and revising and updating our understanding of it in order to get quicker, get faster, get stronger, get better, whatever it takes to improve that capacity for free and independent action.
And certainly, if he inherited some of these ideas from cybernetics, I think that
Yes, he did.
Also recognize that a lot of these, you can regard a lot of the active inference formalism as basically a 21st century version of cybernetics as we had it in the 1950s, probably.
We do have one question on orientation or the generative model that we have to ask, and that has to do with, is it local within the boundary, or is it going into 4E cognition? Is our generative model, I'm talking mine right now, and Moose's and yours, is it contained within here, or is it all around us?
It's contained within there, but it's about all around us. That may sound quite a facetious response, but I think it's quite important because it is the internal states that can be read as encoding the sufficient statistics of your Bayesian beliefs that constitute your generative model of this probabilistic sort, of this mathematical sort, that you can now measure the distance between different probabilistic beliefs like risk. So in saying that, you are saying that the actual generative model is encoded or instantiated on the inside, but the space that it covers, the beliefs that are entailed by that internal biophysical encoding on the inside, are about the outside. That's the whole point of the Markov blanket. It allows you to interpret the inside as a model of the outside. So now you can talk about the information entailed by certain, say, neuronal activity or brain activity as information processing of a particular kind, where it's information about the outside. So this is beyond Shannon information. This is information about the outside, which can be read exactly in the spirit of the hypothesis that we was talking about in the context on the previous slide. These are hypotheses about what could have caused my experimental results. They're not hypotheses. They are beliefs that I have on the inside about the outside causing my experimental data, for example, the data that I use to test my hypotheses about the outside. So in that sense, it entails a synchrony, a coherence between the inside and the outside, simply because if you've got the right model, then what's going on the inside is a reflection of what's going on the outside. And then we get back to not the law of requisite variety, but its sister, the good regulator theorem from cybernetics. That in order to regulate and to engage with my environment, I have to be a good model of that environment.
Well, I would love to title this episode Karl Friston Explains John Boyd's OODA Loop, but we'll figure that out later. Shifting gears, let's talk about markets. You're talking about markets and attractors recently. We brought up Patrick Skotanis' work, the market mind hypothesis. Can you tell us what you're seeing and what you can share with us about maybe using active inference AI, maybe using free energy principle and active inference towards markets and attractors? What's so special to you about that?
Well, that was a really interesting question. I think answered at two different timescales. So Patrick and like-minded theoreticians in economics, I think, are pushing for a move effectively away from behavioral economics to cognitive economics, to put agency and sentience back into the game again. And I would wholeheartedly support that, from the point of view of, cybernetics or the OODA loop or active inference. To understand a complex system such as the markets and the engagement of investors, with that market and constituting that market. I think you have to have this more nuanced view of the way people behave and exchange. Patrick's been pushing for this, writing books about it, and trying to move sort of orthodoxy in the way that economics is taught and applied in that direction. The other more short-term thing is the particular applications of the free energy principle that we've been pursuing from a sort of more pragmatic and purely theoretical perspective, and it's a really interesting domain, because it is exactly a complex system that it has been co-constructed by lots of agents and exists at a particular scale that is distinct from the agents that cause that constitute the market. So certainly free markets, for example. And yet there is an opportunity to write into this complex system modeling active inference in a very explicit way, because you can now focus in on the activity of an investor or an investment team and a portfolio management team, for example, because you can now describe their behavior as consistent with or as driven by the principles of active inference. And if one so does, then one gets into the game of exactly what we're talking about before, of explicitly being able to compute and evaluate and simulate their behavior through the minimization of this risk, where risk is formally defined as this KL divergence between their prior preferences and what will happen if they did that. To do that, though, you have to now install a generative model of the free market. Now, that's an interesting problem, because if you can solve that kind of problem, then you're in a position to deploy that kind of generative model to all sorts of complex systems, healthcare provision, climate change, food security, loads of really important sort of complex systems that if you had a good generative model of, then you can now do the forecasting that is requisite to do exactly the kind of pointing into the future, the counterfactual processing, the rehearsal that we were talking about theoretically when going through the slides. You can now do that. You can evaluate the expected free energy. You can evaluate numerically the risk. We don't have to worry about the ambiguity because there's not much noise on fintech data, but so the risk we can actually evaluate formally for different kinds of policies. And the temperance scheduling. So from my perspective, as somebody who knows nothing about financial markets, it's a wonderful opportunity to test out these ideas, both about the sort of the universal constraints on generative models of complex systems in which we participate and co-construct, and yet are too big for us to influence in any meaningful way as individuals, yet at the same time also test hypotheses about motivated or intentional behavior being motivated by the components that quantify the risk that we were talking about, but also an opportunity to actually connect the dots between risk-sensitive control and pathological control in an engineering context, and the way that economists talk about risk and ambiguity, and uncertainty, for example.
I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to push this up a little bit, and it might be a little too extreme, but let's build a snowmobile. So real fast, we've talked about attractors. We know a little bit about affordances in the environment. You follow Patrick's work on harmonics and things like that, maybe in his book and what he talks about. We know a little bit about the Platonic Space. We've talked about that briefly with Michael Levin. We haven't talked about consciousness yet, but let's bring that all together. Is it possible that collectively we're projecting what we call the market, and that this complex adaptive system, it's a flow system, whatever we want to call it. And if that's true, then what's in our I'll call it our orientation now, the way we're designed. We may be seeking those attractor states, those levels in the market that things bounce off, they go to, or they go through. They may be discoverable. Is that possible? I mean, I know, like I said, I'm going out on a limb here, but based on those things that we've talked about with Patrick's work, attractor states, fitness landscapes, and things like that, and the Platonic space, is it possible that we could find, um, build better maps, internal maps of the external environment when it comes to the market?
I think so, yes. And I think you used all the right words there. So technically that notion of an attractor, I think, is absolutely crucial. So there's some really fundamental constraints on your generative model or your orientation, just by acknowledging that there is an attractor in play. If there's an attractor in play, that tells you a lot about the nature of the dynamics that would constitute your priors of your generative model. And these priors have never been leveraged before, to my knowledge, in macroeconomics or sort of financial modeling. People have come a little bit close by putting 20th century physics and equilibria, so sort of dynamic stochastic equilibrium modeling in financial markets. It starts to get a bit close, but it misses the point that the market is an open system. And therefore it cannot be modeled with equilibria. You have to move to non-equilibria. So you have to move to the kind of physics that the free energy principle deals with. You have to move to open systems that have non-equilibria. Why are they open? Because there's a Markov blanket that is porous. So now if you put the maths of disequilibrium, non-equilibrium, um, self-organization into play, you now have the bare bones of a generative model that can, or an orientation that any one person or any one group, if they're sharing that narrative or that generative model, could then use to do their own policy evaluation, and or indeed sort of offload that onto a computer, with the right kind of model.
I tell you what, Karl, if you can call David and Michael at any minute and just say, "Hey, we want to go forward with this. We're ready to go." I'll just say that. We'll keep that in this this episode. But we don't want to go too deep in this because we're looking at this right now and it's unbelievable, to be honest with you. Anything, Moose, on markets at the moment?
I mean, so much of it's hard to top. I can't top it other than say, like, I'm really glad, Karl, that you said all that. It was the not the last part that you said, the part right before that really resonated with me, and I've lost it all of a sudden. But
I think the connection to Mises, is that what you're thinking?
yeah, that's it. Because Hayek and Mises are often dismissed because they're not mathematical economists, and when you study those things that are looking at things that are axiomatic, that are a priori, and there's no econometric uh, visuals and things like that, people dismiss it, and that's why I wound up getting my master's degree, and motivated by Mises and Hayek and others, because being a bachelor of arts in history, I found that economics explained that way made more sense, specifically around the actions of humans and the decisions of humans. And some of the parallels right before I met Ponch, I was working with a collaborator friend of ours, also went to Cambridge as well, as you did, um, in a Cambridge economist, and we were actually connecting Boyd in his concept of orientation, with Mises and Hayek, specifically around human action, and what Mises called the praxeological axiom. So it was to hear you say that was really refreshing.
Let's move over to psychedelics and flow. I mentioned Robin Carhart-Harris's work with the Rebus model and entropic brain hypothesis. Can you talk a little bit about? I think, to me, when people are in a meditative state, or they're working out, or they're even dreaming, you're in some type of flow state. You're getting access to really relax your default mode of seeing the world, and you get to revisit things through counterfactuals, and that would be that orange pathway we talked about. That's just my rough, this is how I think it works. But can you talk a little bit about how psychedelics affect active inference and what you think is going on?
Yeah, well, there's a deep link between the action of psychedelics and the changes in your computational architecture in your brain when you engage in, say, mindfulness or meditation, and I presume actually, sort of doing lots of sport. Um, I think the simplest way to conceptualize this is to revert back to this predictive coding metaphor or implementation of this orientation, where you're getting the newsworthy part of the sensory observations in order to update your generative model, to test your hypotheses, ultimately, and to realize that there is a lever to turn, a knob to turn on the degree to which you pay attention to certain observations relative to what you have already learned and know a priori. And this knob is is known by various names. In my world, it would be called precision. It's just the inverse volatility. So the inverse variability or dispersion or variance or dissipation. So the complement of that is something that's very, very precise. Something which you can imbue with a high degree of credence or reliability or confidence. So if you read precision as confidence, I think it's probably the simplest way. So what we're talking about now is that if we want to use orientation as a word of, the right kind of belief updating on the basis of observations in the service of testing my hypotheses, then you would you'll also have to be very careful about adjusting the balance between the precision afforded the observations relative to your prior beliefs that you've accumulated in your generative model. If you afford the observations too little precision, then all of your sense making will be dominated by your prior beliefs and you'll miss stuff. If, on the other hand, you afford too much precision or confidence or credence to the observations, the evidence at hand, in relation to your hypotheses, then you're going to subvert your prior hypotheses and you're going to be effectively exposed to overfitting and possibly even false inferences that are not constrained by your prior beliefs. So that balance is really important. And that balance, just for those people who read Andy Clark, we're talking about precision-weighted prediction errors. We're talking about the precision weighting of a prediction error. So this is a sort of second-order aspect of active inference or predictive coding. It's not just about the prediction. You've also got to predict the predictability or predict the confidence. So, this has, again, some beautiful connections with the markets in terms of, people worrying about the market's lost confidence. That means, and volatility models in economics. All of these are about estimating and predicting fluctuations in the precision of various things. From the point of view of, an experimentalist or a scientist, it's basically how much weight do you give your experimental results in relation to your convictions about your prior hypotheses. So if you get that wrong, you can expose yourself to all sorts of psychopathology. Sometimes it's useful to relax the precision of deeply held convictions, prior convictions, if they're no longer fit for purpose. So this is the Rebus relaxation of these overly, unduly precise prior beliefs, and paying more attention to the sensory evidence at hand, just to explore different hypotheses. So psychedelics act on the part on receptors that basically control the excitability of various neuronal populations that encode this credence, confidence, or precision. And they do so selectively by reducing, or it is thought that they do so selectively by reducing the precision deep inside the model, your prior convictions, relative to the sensory information. So when you take psychedelics, you're now paying much more attention, and your percepts are much more elemental, much closer to the sensory epithelia. They're all about sort of colors and shapes. They're not about the causes of the colors and shapes, like faces or houses or high-level abstractions that we normally, perceptual hypotheses would bring to the table to explain all of these elemental things. And in the same way, in say certain sort of meditative practices, say breathing meditations, you're trying to get some volitional control over this balance between the prior precision and the sensory precision by really focusing, endowing a particular modality, say proprioceptive and interoceptive signals from breathing, with a high precision, and then suppressing the precision of everything else, even to the extent you get into a non-dual state. The precision of these very high level beliefs, for example, I am me, is now flattened. It's reduced. Just to bring this response to closure, but also to speak to your, I think, important notion of landscapes here. One way of thinking about precision is in terms of movement on a Waddington landscape, on a free energy landscape, so that if you now, we should have done variational free energy. If we just read the free energy as surprise, for example, as the total amount of precision motive prediction error, then as we are doing our belief updating, we are changing the free energy, and that induces a landscape, a free energy landscape. And we're always trying to find the minimum. We're always trying to find the path of least action through this landscape. So the path of least action literally is exactly the kind of we were talking about before in terms of action that is free and independent and very efficient, is literally finding that the lowest point of this free energy landscape as we do our belief updating, as we do our planning as well. And clearly the nature of the paths that are traced out on this landscape depend upon how sharp those minima are, how the curvature of this landscape, and basically what the Rebus hypothesis says is that sometimes you can get stuck in a rut. You can have very, very precise, overly precise ways of moving through your belief updating and consequent actions and responses to situations, both perceptual and in terms of your behavior, that are no longer fit for purpose. And let's say you've moved house, or a loved one has died, your world has died, or there's some, there's the Iran war. Everything you knew before is now no longer fit for purpose in terms of prior beliefs that afford the best hypotheses for this particular. So you now become disorientated. But sometimes you don't know that because you assign so much precision to your prior beliefs, you're not actually paying attention to what's going on out there. So to do that, to remediate that, then you have to relax the precision and decrease the curvature of these free energy landscapes. That can be done with psychedelics, and it can also be done with meditation. So I think the notion of a landscape where the attractor now is just the points to which you are attracted when you're trying to find the minima of this landscape is a very useful heuristic. And just to repeat, the precision corresponds to the curvature, the steepness of these minima.
So Andrew Gallimore writes about methyltryptamine, DMT, and he uses the fitness landscape in a lot of your, I believe, the free energy principle and active inference to explain exactly what you just said, right? And so I know a lot of people don't read about books on DMT or about DMT, but they should take a look at that because I think that he does a great job in explaining that there. I do want to spend a few more minutes. Again, we've been going for 2 hours. I want to flip over to consciousness and then AI, but in the context of consciousness, we've had Dr. Hippolito on here a few years ago. And about that time she was on here, she wrote about autism as well, and connecting to the free energy principle. Can you talk a little bit about the hard problem with consciousness and maybe how FEP looks at um, autism?
Yeah, and I'll try and do it in a way which moves from autism to consciousness. Autism is in computational psychiatry is the poster child example of when we get that balance between the sensory precision and the prior precision wrong. And the particular failure, or the story at least, in severe autism, is that there is a failure to attenuate the sensory precision, which just basically means I can't ignore anything. I am exposed to the sensorium, so I am compelled to explain every little elemental stimulation, observation that I am exposed to. And this comes at the price of never building precise, more abstract generative models, orientating in a way that you can abstract and explain, create hypotheses about the causes of all this elemental sensory stimulation. So that explains a lot of the classical triad and a lot of the attendant signs and symptoms of severe autism. People will avoid unpredictable people with severe autism will avoid very unpredictable situations and try to make the world as elemental and predictable as possible by, say, self-stimulation. Also because they're they've assigned great precision or credence to the sensory level of perception. They're also you can get idiot savants who are very gifted in terms of reproducing visual impressions graphically, for example. Again, at the price that there's no central coherence or no sort of abstract narrative behind it. It's just but there is incredible detail that they are aware of, which people like me and you might not be aware of. One consequence of the inability to build these deeper generative models that explain or have hypotheses that are more abstract and more apt to describe relationships and especially other things like me, for example, the mother, means that you never develop a full sense of the other, and in particular the mother, the mom. Yeah. So if you can't develop a hypothesis that the world is populated by others, you're never going to develop a sense of self. So to have because the sense of self is just the hypothesis that I am like this thing that I have observed, and this thing that I have observed, my mother, is an agent and has beliefs and has autonomy and has intentions. So it takes several years for us to develop to even develop the hypothesis that I am like another. In particular, I am like my carers or the things I see around me, other people around me, and therefore I am a self. So you get this. This explains the impoverished theory of mind that people with severe autism have. And the reason I introduce theory of mind just means I can entertain the notion that you are another self, that you have a perspective and intentional stance, that you are sentient in some way, and that I can deploy my beliefs about myself in the service explaining your beliefs. But if I've not got in my repertoire of hypotheses in my generative model even the notion that the world is divided into self and other, I will never develop a theory of mind. And I will never be self-aware. So I'm trying to work towards what you would need as part of your generative model that would support consciousness of a narrative, personal sort of, a minimal kind of selfhood that, a minimal selfhood that entails some awareness that I am me. We don't need that. Lots of things are like, I would imagine insects and lower life forms, and certainly plants don't need a sense of self. But we are equipped because we have these very deep generative models, if we're lucky, and if we don't get severe autism, for example, or we don't grow up as a feral child. if you look at the literature on children who have not been exposed to other things like themselves, they have great difficulties relating to other things, and of course representing themselves, as another thing of this kind. There are lots of interesting issues that we could talk about. I can imagine that I'm exhausted. I imagine that you're getting exhausted as well. Just to measure what we could have talked about, and perhaps next time, if I can come back, we can pursue this. I think to really qualify as conscious, you'd have to be an agent. And to really qualify as being an agent, you'd have to have intentions. And to qualify as having intentions, you'd have to have a generative model of the future, which means that we are talking exactly about the expected free energy aspects, that green line, the type 2, system 2 kind of thinking. So you can actually specify the necessary attributes of your orientation and your hypothesis set for this kind of thing that would be necessary to support consciousness, which is why I can say, glibly and polemically, a single cell can't be conscious, simply because it can't plan. You'll never get a single cell to look into the future. It's a beautiful, fast and frugal, efficient little machine where it is at the timescale it exists, but it's not in and of itself sufficiently self-similar and big enough to do the kind of planning that you and I can do.
I tell you, this has been incredible. I want to move on to AI real fast, and we've been going for 2 hours. This is a huge cognitive load to have this conversation for all of us, I hope. But I do want to talk about AI, and I want to share something with you first before we do that. So large language models. We equate large language models to the linear observer-oriented decide act loop, right? It's a closed system. It doesn't engage with the external world. And then we know you're working on active inference, which it looks more like, free energy principle active inference looks more like this. Can you tell us where we are in the, I don't know if there's in the life cycle of AI, what's coming next, what's happening today? Just give us some context on how you see the world in regard to AI.
Don't take anything I say too seriously there. I'm not an influencer in this space, so I take a strictly sort of academic perspective on this, and also in part a clinical perspective on it. But as far as I can see, the AI of a generative sort that currently is sort of the center stage and the source that is attracting all the funding and money and indeed underwriting the GDP in America at the present time. That is a particular style of AI which is nothing to do with active inference. It's a beautiful feat of engineering, but it has certain aspects that I think provide a ceiling to what it will and can achieve. And those ceilings are sometimes described in terms of a poverty of efficiency, in exactly the same way we were talking about before in terms of free and independent action on the path of least action. They're also described in terms of a lack of explainability. Just by having a generative model or a way to orientate yourself on the inside means that you have an explainable intelligence. So natural intelligence is always explainable and always by construction maximally efficient in the various ways that we've been talking about. Much of these constraints and limitations inherit from the fact they don't encode uncertainty. So they don't know what they don't know. If you don't know what you don't know, you can't evaluate the information gain or the risk. If you can't evaluate the information gain and the risk, you can't act intelligently. So you can only generate content. You can't act, which means you can't prompt, for example. So generative AI cannot act in the way that we have been talking about from Gibson and cybernetics through to the OODA loop to the non-autistic child experimenting and asking questions of the world to work out there's a mother there, and the mother is an intentional being. So all of this true agency is denied, despite the hype about agentic AI using large language models. I think that's a nonsense, because there's nothing on the inside. There's no situational awareness. There is none of all the mechanics that we've been talking about that would necessitate agency. So where's it going to go? It's going to, I think, very much like, well, let me preface this again by saying that, large language models, transformer architectures, and the current deployment in commerce and all the investment that entails are beautiful, really beautiful and impressive, probably the most impressive engineering feat, apart from going to the moon, this century. But that's not the direction of travel if you want true intelligent artifacts, because you're going to have to be much more biomimetic. You're going to have to comply with the principles of least action. You're going to have to encode uncertainty. You're going to have to deal with belief updating and hypothesis testing, orientation in exactly the way that we've been talking about. And that requires a different tech. And that tech is now, I think, some people are talking about this in terms of explicit biomimetic computation, such as photonics, memristas, silver nanowires, even organoids. And another group of people are talking about thermodynamic computation, both of them emphasizing the efficiency angle. And if there's a commitment to having the right generative model under the hood to put the explainability, the uncertainty in play, the risk ability to evaluate risk, the information gain and curiosity, then I think that is the future of artificial intelligence, or at least intelligent artifacts, artifactual intelligence, which will be much, much closer to natural intelligence. To succinctly summarize that, what we're talking about is building machines that have a constrained curiosity. So your large language model will start to prompt you because it generally wants to know about you. And once it knows about you, it might develop a sense of self, and it might become conscious.
I think that's a great place to wrap it up. We've been going for 2 hours and 15 minutes tonight. I cannot thank you enough for joining us. We've been looking forward to this for a while, been trying to at least get our understanding of how things are kind of operating in different domains before we had this conversation. But again, Karl, thank you so much for being here. And I think this is going to be one of the most impactful episodes. Moose, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, thanks for your time. And we'd love to have you back to talk about the structure and creation and other things.
Yeah.
You'll send me the paper and I'll read it over the summer holidays next Easter. We've done Easter holidays.
Well, it's a very brief paper. It's not a big paper. That was one of the what people that dismiss it find, though, and why a lot of the circular OODA crowd or the reductionist OODA crowd, it's extremely dense. You'll get it.
Yeah,
We're pretty confident you're going to get it. But a lot of the people that haven't done the intellectual work, that it just goes right over their head.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much. We're going to keep you on here just for a minute. I'm going to stop recording, and then I'll just do a quick debrief as soon as we stop.
Thank you, Karl. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.